Thank you all for being here tonight. So I'm just going to give a short introduction before Patrick reads a text that is a translation of a text that was published earlier this September, yes. So Patrick Autréaux is no stranger to Boston University. Over the past few years, we have been really fortunate to have Patrick Autréaux be part of Boston University intellectual life through different venues, going all the way back to April 2013, when he gave a lecture series on Quand les livres tous se taisent and Écrire le moi malade, When Books Fall Silent, Writing the Ailing Self, and Écrire la vocation, Writing or as vocation and beyond. Since then, he has read and discussed several of his works here at this, particularly at the Center for the Study of Europe, and has taught several times for us a seminar, and which he is teaching this semester. In 2018 and 2019, he taught a seminar through the writer's eye, and he's currently teaching a seminar, but more oriented on trauma and literature through the writer's eye. Published at the prestigious Gallimard and the Edition Verdier in France, the recipient of several writers' residencies in Belgium, Canada, and France, his work has been increasingly visible and recognized. A number of his texts have appeared or have been adapted and performed throughout France, most particularly Les Irréguliers in Paris, Lyon, Strasbourg, Bordeaux, and Toulouse. He has been and is a regular presence at Le Marathon des Mots, which is an international annual literary event in Toulouse. And then whether it is Quand la parole attend la nuit, Pussy Boy, or La Sainte de la famille, his novels combine previous threads, exploring the internal intellectual pathway linking medicine and writing. And I think your seminar, maybe that's something you'll come back to, and maybe also in the text, you're addressing that, some of these threads being woven together. Exploring further the boundaries and mirroring effect of the medical world and the range of emotions that it may crystallize. A number of his lectures for the seminar have appeared in different journals and magazines. He speaks to the quality of his interventions and his ability to engage his audience. The same is true when it comes to the quality of his writing. It conveys a spirit of experimentation with an innovative qualities, as it is, for instance, in Le Dedans des Choses. I must say I have a really weak spot for it. It's one of my favorites. It feels like a treasure box, a jewel in itself in the crafting of images. And I'll come back to we have a painter, but I'll come back to the importance of images, and particularly in this text today. And again, pushing further the boundaries of imaginary spaces and inner places. And the place maybe nature can play as a role, and again, this is something we might want to discuss in a little while. At the same time, though, his writing has progressively shown an engagement with the social and political world, looking at social designations and prejudices, exploring the border places between intimate and social experience. His short story, Je ne suis pas Charlie, and his novel, Les Irréguliers, are both an obvious demonstration of such approach, and a concrete example of words put into action. Texts such as Le Dedans des Choses in 2012, La Voix, écrite, 2017, and Quand la parole attend la nuit, 2019, are emblematic of the writer's increasing experimentation with genres and form. His novel Pussy Boy, 2020, is most telling in that respect. As with his previous texts, it shows a deep maturation process one project, or the request for a text as part of a text, a conference, a homage, propelled him to further expand on a reflective process, whether it is on sexuality, desire, or the subversive. I could go on and on about some of his writing. Today, while we have had Patrick Autréaux coming and speaking to us several times, it has always been until now essentially about, except for Je suis Charlie, it has always been about his fictional works. And today this is a text that is part of a series of texts that have appeared in different journals, magazines, and that are exploring more his the side of his writing as an art critic. And so this is maybe something we want to just explore with you, and experiment with you. Thank you, Patrick, for being here.
Thank you very much, Odile. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to read only this text, The Moors of Time, which was published in Revue Esprit very recently. And then we open the discussion, the questions. Thomas Hardy's The Return of the Native was a favorite novel of a sculptor friend of mine, my dearest friend. He would often evoke its prologue, which describes the heath. It's a main character, he would say, a landscape become visage. On this first section, I knew nothing more than its title, which he would sometimes cite when we see each other, a while having passed, a face on which time makes but little impression. I would regularly promise to read it, but always got waylaid. The time will come, I thought. Later on, I discovered Shamosine poems, those written about the mummified bodies found in the acid soil of the moors, which resonated for the Irish poet with the troubles and the terrible sacrifices made to pacify the people in Ireland. These poems raised a melancholy as changeable as the face of the swamp, something between pain and fascination, fright and reverie. For me, they were linked to that book of Hardy's and to the memory of my friend's enthusiasm, even if I had given up on reading the novel, which had become the custodian of our dead friendship. Because in the meantime, our friendship had broken down. There had been no dispute, only a crack, which was the signal of its wreck, almost without my being aware. I lived far away, and according to our habits, we would meet up before each of my departures. That year, after a decade of work, I had just published my first book, and it had made some waves. I clearly felt some embarrassment on his part the last time we had spoken on the phone, but I'd preferred to ignore the possibility that a friendship-killing rivalry could have arisen between us. On my return, one message after another went without a response, and the grating words he would sometimes slip into conversation came back to me. Those which, if I hadn't wanted to forget, I had at least tried to justify as a consequence of the kinds of moods to which I knew he was susceptible. I insisted, wanted to understand. My letters and emails went unanswered. Our mutual friends couldn't tell me for what exactly he reproached me. Time began to hollow out a distance ever more impossible to overcome between our once incessant dialogues and this silence. Still, each time I returned to Paris, my trip was overshadowed by an as yet undead weight. I was angry and sad at being so. Suddenly taken by an impulse to reconcile, I would feel ready to make honorable amends before quickly passing from great forgiveness to violent resentment. This yo-yoing would bite. It had taken many manuscripts, abandoned manuscripts, to get to my first book. Now, thanks to what had opened up within me following an uncertain recovery from aggressive lymphoma, I was driven by the violent urge to write. As for my friend, he had completely disappeared from my life. I could not even find any trace of him online. I only knew that he had also ended up breaking off relations with most of our mutual friends. Disappointed by the reaction to his latest work, he no longer exhibited. One acquaintance, who I saw again by chance, said he had stopped sculpting completely. He was dead without being so. Hardy's book was also floating in that limbo. Strangely, he had never offered it to me. I had bought it for myself. It sat there on a shelf. I no longer even thumbed through it. The words of my lost friend would come back sometimes, always the same ones about the moors and the face which did not change. I preferred to leave it among that library, much larger than my own, comprised of books unread, we don't want to read, won't ever read, or have promised we will never. But he hadn't died. He had only vanished from my thoughts, and so would it randomly return, a face comprised of words, hidden within a title, that started to peer out at me as would an almost perfect mummy, a face on which time makes but little impression. Did the writing that had kept me so occupied have to grind to a halt and open out the moors of extinguished desire, so as to rediscover that face on which had made little impression? While traversing a period of profound doubt after having finished a cycle of writing, I began to think about that friend who had been lost, the feeling of failure that had perhaps led him to stop sculpting, and the profound reorganization of his life it must have entitled. I had the impression of crossing the same impasse myself, and for that, of being taken back to him. Again, I felt the need to better understand our relationship and its ends. Is that what made me want to write? Obstinately, I started back, but writing about drought is a challenge. And I soon ran into something in the story which I couldn't conclude. It seemed to me that this thing, which was unable to end, this death without death, made my tale impossible. Perhaps I was hobbled by a grief I had refused. I soon resolved to abandon the manuscript. After one final reread, skimming over the accumulated outlines and digressions, I glimpsed other faces that I hadn't intended to include in the book. I had in my home a portrait the sculptor had done of my grandfather. He knew all of my parents and our family history, the separation and the death. He knew the genealogy of my reading. Throughout these working notes, crumbs of presents had been sown, which, however, led not to the house of the ogre, but to that of a French mystic, Thérèse de Lisieux, whom I had reread thanks to him, and about whom we had often talked. That saint's name had hung over several personal drama. I had already sketched out a short book about her, and this was the hypothesis, and that subsequently dazzled me. What if I tried to recover that which, between her misfortune and mine, between the faces that had started disappearing around me, seemed coincidental? That was how I managed to recover a taste for writing back into the past, how little by little I was able to escape the shadowed heath. And while I wove my family's history with the well-known fate of the young girl, I felt another domain open up within me, unexpectedly at first, the unblocking of a literature that was not a mass of memories, but instead the landscape of memory. I was suddenly aware that it was not one book I was writing, but several. Following this vision, a ferment took me. Within a couple of days, provisional plans had been made. It was immediately clear that it would not be an unfolding of memory, but a volume of events and emotions, of gardens and thought, a temporal body. Writing that would give form to the time through which I had passed, not to raise a commemorative monument to it, but to feel its steaming air. Less a history than writing of what in the present had been electrified by it, writing the changing skies over the moors of time. Often, it is in a state of calm panic that we write, a panic which is nothing more than a means of establishing disorder. One undoubtedly has to be shaken up from top to bottom, so as to cracken up the tombs which exist unknowingly within. The first book was written, a second, due to circumstances there is no need to go here into, reworked my plans, a third was soon underway. If we think in terms of global vision, slow waving and unexpected leaps, the time of writing is without a uniform direction. Thus, sparking fresh surprises, I realized that I was in the course of taking up once more the main line of a far older manuscript, the first I had completed, but which had never been published. It was a text at once too dense and too thin to contain that which I was still yet to experience. All the protagonists, however, were already on stage. There was the questions of family and first love, of the past and the characters who had marked my childhood, of art and the friendship of youth, of the saints I read, and the landscapes of bygone days from which I would draw poems. Awkwardly Proustian, it was a text offering shades of melancholy. Even if I had abandoned it for years, it seemed to mark the beginnings of my life as a writer, like a cairn in a grey and misted land. Could I have imagined one day seeing it loom into my future work? Either way, something had matured. It had taken the 10 books which I had written in the meantime to bring over this involuntary reprise. In writing, I have never known how to bend myself, except through domestication, to a narrative temporarily that is well ordered if punctuated by flashback. The problem, which I came to recognize late, has always been that I have written respecting the shape of time I have felt it. With poetry, that's no cause for alarm. I have figured out how to paint the water lilies in my head easily enough. But once I begin to write a narrative, I find myself encumbered by too many images, too many thoughts, too many associations. So many pop-ups are triggered in my mind. It is as though I were a screen swamped with windows, each jittering out their world. And unto this is grafted a rather banal feeling of illegitimacy, reinforced by my lack of literary studies, by now what uncultured background, so many shackles against which I have long fought. But then I understood more clearly why I had so much difficulty writing. Quite late, I discovered that I had synesthesia, by which I mean I spontaneously associate perception, and notably that I see time as though it were space. My days, weeks, years, my historic chronology appear to me as a giant count, and I wander through time like the bonhomme d'Ampère on the volume Flux. I have thus always associated time which flows and that which is. Ours have a double measure, the conventional one and the one which allows the passing of clouds and their evolution into imaginary forms, the wind or the rain shaping the light. Time, for me, is a landscape. When I started to write stories, I would crash into this mental particularity of which I was unaware. I wrote in a very compact way, packing together ideas, images, and sensations with no apparent logical connection. I wrote badly. I lived with it as though it were handicapped. No doubt that it is why I published my first book so late. It was by becoming aware of this link between time and space that I was better able to understand how time and story express themselves to me and how one proceeds from the other. From then on, I accepted my inner detours in time no less than that the design would need the refining. I could no longer do it, but by short-circuiting a linearity which I never felt in life. Temporality in stories, remember, is a formal constraint linked to a social anthropological structures. Other eras and other cultures minimize or care not for linear time and narratives. Think of the philosophers who have contrasted the arrow of history with ritual or mystic time, of the kinetic geographies of indigenous song Bruce Chatwin evoked, of the Apache toponymies described by Keith Basso, or the Chinese Li, of which Segalen spoke, a measure of distance as much as the reliefs of the terrain, and therefore the time needed to cross it. That then is how I had to compose with the wandering in my brain. Much has been written on the body and literature, on sexuality and illness especially. Yet, if literature and the body are connected, they are so by social and psychological singularities, and above all the physiological, more precisely neurological singularities of the author. Perhaps indeed, writing is no more than that, following the Tao of a singular physiology, accepting if one is colorblind of you will write so. It took me several years and a number of failed manuscripts to reach here, perhaps. More than anything else, it was by initiating this autobiographical polyptych that I have been better able to approach the shape of my interior time. I had already written several books which unquestionably attempted it, but this time the project was developing in multiple volumes and through the discovery, as I mentioned, of a manuscript I had left behind many years before. If, however, this latency period had unconditioned my writing, it had allowed me to grasp a means of writing something which I had never been able to tame in any of my previous work, time. And yet, for this polyptych to be fully sketched out of my mind, it took a vital coincidence. Several sections had already been laid out, but it was not yet a real cycle tracing the limits of the landscape I was writing. It lacked a vanishing point. It was that which materialized with the reappearance of the friend who had been lost from sight so long. From an article, I learned that he had recently exhibited his latest work for the first time since our separation. I had missed the exhibition, but could see photos of it on the gallery's website. I recognized all canvases, which had been overhauled, but there was also a new body of work that was more or less aligned with what he had done before. I was troubled by this unexpected reunion. Something within me came undone, an almost forgotten sorrow. I was strangely relieved that he had continued to create and that he was exhibiting again, that he lived still. There was no bitterness or reawakening of rivalry, but deliverance. The horizon of his apparent artistic failure no longer threatened. Knowing that he was not stuck in the mire and having proof of it freed me completely from the fear of nauseous delusions that creativity bears and which, for me, he had come to embody. What I immediately felt seeing his work, whatever I think of their quality, was that I would finally be able to write about a friendship that had been so important in my youth, and thus map out a perspective in my book, creating a space with time. Still, patience would be required to write it. What comes back does not necessarily boomerang, but simply, rather, stays in place. Time buries it, and so, to be aware of it, we have to dig a little. And what returns is not always that which died, mummy or ghost, but something that has evolved on different reasons or exists according to more abstract plans. To write is to become a little animal, a mole in his burrow, who has no clear concept and never will, perhaps, of the space-time through which it passes, and at the border of which, with a clumsy gesture, unknown and familiar moorland opens out, the deep structure of a landscape. A face on which time makes but little impression. That is a phrase that came back to me on seeing my friend's work. Henceforth, a character in my book. It shaped a vault, making it a graspable whole. Across those moors, there were time had passed, the fog and the setting sun, and it wasn't its earth from which the book sprung, moorland being poor soil, but from the space suddenly opened up, future, past, present, within, which a life reflected on, and an improbable fate unfolded. In other words, a sculpture of time. Since adolescence, I have loved the landscape of moors and peat bogs, those of the Erlkönig of Goethe, or Novalis, or the earth poems of Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, the country of withering heights, Rilke's letter describing Worpswede. I have long thought that for me literature is linked to the dead, or rather those of the ever undying. It is true for some of my books. Writing to me seems to create another novel of the mummy. No doubt that is why I love Seamus Inebog's poems. I had often spoken about their tanned skin to my friend, whose digital presence could once more be discerned, the wrinkles, the pores, the hairs, and plaits. We were fascinated by their surprised or slipping looks, by the engulfing fear of which only a cord around the neck remained, eternal perhaps from having had to die so soon. Those bark bodies symbolize the loss of our youth. They were revenant in his dreams, like bodies he thought he had hidden in the woods, and which would make him in a sweat. For me, they were my forgotten grandmother, and what from earliest childhood had been obscured with her. For a long time, after the breakdown of our friendship, I said that the one disillusioned by art had become a sacrifice to the swamp. But on discovering his new work, it wasn't a mummified face that I found, but a being who danced still. And though recognizing this did not reawaken our friendship, it did revive why we had doubtless been friends, a never-ending quest to free ourselves from the weight of desolation by bringing back light to the hinterlands. I have no intention of seeing my friend again, but perhaps I will finally read that novel by Thomas Hardy, which seemed to symbolize what I was trying to write, a return to what we often grasp very early in our life, the perception of a kind of bone structure that we seek to make out beneath the event through which we go, of which sometimes an abandoned manuscript will have kept a premature trace, and which it will be taken a whole lifetime to be able to complete, not time regained, or the return of the ancient dead and their subterranean ways, nor a time of interminable grief, but something sculpted entirely in the present and in a language that has required the time in which to find the moment to be written. Thank you. And sorry for the French accent.
Well, what can I say? In my own accent. So this is a text where the I is very present, and yet it is a text that goes well beyond just going back to your writing and the different steps that the way your writing got transformed and evolved. It is also about art, about sculpture, about landscapes, about time as landscape, about a certain vision in your writing, about the place of the body in your writing, and an I that might be, maybe one of the questions I could ask is, who is this I compared to we? The place of the I and the social and the society. You are in the lands and almost going away from everyone, and yet it's almost a place for where from you're looking at the world. Could you come back to that a little bit? To your starting point, maybe also of these mummified bodies and the Moors.
That is quite a complex question, I think, to me, because it seems to be the the core maybe of my writing. I realize each time that I go back to a place of, I wouldn't say desolation, but kind of desolation, a ghosty place, where Deleuze would say, where there is a people is missing there. And in a way, I realized that I was going back always to that place where some people is missing. And it's as if I was sucking the energy of this ghost spirit, this melancholy, this kingdom in between, which is fueling my writing, and that I cannot really explain. I connect to a thing in me, which is not really connected to a very specific grief, and which is not connected to a special biographic event. It has been. I began to write about autobiographical events and grief and so on, mourning, but I realized that it was in fact incidental, and that I was coming back to this place where, I don't know, I feel this kind of nakedness that some other moments in my life made me experience. And I realized that this nakedness is really the moment where I feel a kind of legitimacy to write, as if I could be able naked to write. And I need that, actually. I need this nakedness. So I push all cultural elements, even books, even complicated literary ideas that I can also have. I push also the social problems, social ideas, and then I let them come back. But I need to be in this place of
sort of decanting.
Kind of, yes. Also to be not to have the impression to be myself. It doesn't mean anything to me. But on the contrary, in this kind of place of field, of ghosty place, not to feel myself, and to feel open to a kind of listening, which is difficult to achieve actually in the daily life, or even when you are beginning to write. It's a process actually. When I begin to write, I need to write a lot to go to this place inside me where something happens that some kind of mental state that I'm listening to something I was not planning. Even though there is always a structure, I need a structure to go to this kind of place. But it's as if you built a kind of bridge on the moor or on the swamp. You need a bridge to go on the swamp. But then the writing is coming from the fog, not from the bridge itself.
It is a text about life, about death, about the mooring of time, the passing of time and the changes occurring in the process. Whether it is about beliefs, love, or especially friendship here, touching also on you just mentioned it about the nakedness or vulnerability, but touching on the physicality of death itself, or certainly kind of circling around or approaching it at times. As with in your fiction, previous writings, there are references to readings and to books. Here, it is interesting because you start with a reference and a book that, in a sense, is your ties or your link to this friend, but it is a book that you have not read or didn't want to read, or maybe one day would read or not. And then there is, of course, there is Seamus Heaney's bog poems and the mummified bodies in the moor. So there is also mentions of several writers, German writers, and poems. Can you come back maybe a little bit to these different literary influences? We were talking on the way about German Romanticism, if you want to elaborate a little more.
Well, what I was describing just before, I think they are all together. They are connected to the poems I have read when I was a teenager, and I was German speaking first, not English speaking. So French speaking, but German literature was my first. Was the literature through which I came to literature, and especially the poets of the beginning of the 19th century, so Novalis and this poem from the German Romanticism. And since that time, probably because it was a click between a kind of way of not describing but feeling the in consciousness or in conscience. I don't know which word we could use, but that was just my way of being when I was a teenager, and probably because I had gone through a very early childhood grief. So probably my mind is structured by this. And so it's really the encounter of one type of literature, one type of poems, and a person. And from there, well, I didn't really think about it. It just came to me, and the process of writing for me is just I write as if I was deaf and blind. I don't really project. I don't really think. Most of the time, I don't think. The moment I'm thinking, I'm lost. So I really need to be on this level of being in a foggy mind, even though drinking and smoking is not good for that kind of mental state. So yeah. It's a kind of natural fogginess, and. I realized that this was also these moments in my life where words were disappearing that I was interested in. So each time I've really had the impression to build a book at some point, it's always a place where at some moment, for different reasons, words disappeared and left me alone, me, my body, and my mental fogginess, in front of a nothing. And that is always what is triggering a book, really. And so this text actually came very strangely, because I was asked to write about, by somebody, to write about time, and I didn't plan to write about Thomas Hardy, but it came back like this. And then I realized that, in fact, I'm pretty sure that this is the beginning of the fourth book I'm writing on this cycle of autobiographical cycle, and that during years I was trying to write about this friendship, this lost friendship, but more about one special moment which also triggered the writing of all this cycle, where I was in, it was very precise. I was in New York City, and I was walking on the 10th Avenue, and it was raining. I had a migraine, and I was kind of depressed. And then suddenly I experienced a kind of state of being completely emptied by my French language. And I was completely frightened, but naked, but from inside. And this lasted, I don't know, few minutes, I don't know, 1 hour maybe, I don't remember. And what I remember is that I was obliged at some point to grasp some words because I was having nearly hallucination. It was an episode of derealization, depersonalization, as we say in psychiatry. But I was really trying to grasp some words, and it was on English words that came to me. French disappeared. I was abandoned, and
by your language.
By my own language, which I had the impression had betrayed me. And English, some words, not sentences, but some words. And I began to write a poem, but like in my head or in a small book then after. And I think this title, The Return of the Native, or this first sentence, which is the title of the first chapter of Return of the Native of Thomas Hardy, A Face on Which Time Makes But Little Impression, were also words which were in my mind. And at some point when I was in the fog of writing about time and not knowing what I was going to write, my mind grabbed these two expressions, and then I built a text. It was an analogy between the two experiences.
I was smiling because I'm not a mind reader. It was just that I was fortunate to be in Patrick Autréaux' seminar last week, and there was the Canadian, should we call her Canadian, Catherine Mavrikakis, who was coming and via Zoom, but also about who she was and in terms of language and her rapport to her Greek origins, her fascination with Diamanda Galas, and but I'm also going back to an era to the 80s and AIDS and the mourning and what it meant, the disappearance of a whole generation and of friends and the mourning that was in her own writing, and you asked her how she was situating herself between these different spaces and language. And afterwards, we continued, and we were talking about Deleuze and Foucault, and there was a student asking a question about if learning another language, she was talking about French or other languages, how to understand your own language better. And so you were saying that you were asking yourself about what do English words do to me? What do they do to my language, meaning my writerly language? So maybe I wanted to go back to that question, because it's true that it's there, it's in other texts, sometimes it's in the form of music, of reference to an American song or other. Sometimes it's in the form of reference to a film that you might have seen in New York, or there's a whole landscape of New York also that is there in several of your texts or in the background. But there are also English words, and I wanted to go back to this, which may not be as noticeable here because it's a translation of a text, but if we were to read the original text, it's all, sparse.
I would say you have to make the difference between the cultural references to British or literature or American literature or the culture in general, which is different from the language itself. So I will answer about the language itself, because I have no answer, in fact. And I really don't know exactly. I'm still thinking about this, especially about, because I have to refer to my own biography. So coming to English-speaking country was not my choice. And I accepted it with enthusiasm, but it was not my choice. And so I realized after a few years that it was as if I was in a little island of French, surrounded by a huge, violent, aggressive ocean of English around me. And this, I realized at some point that I was protecting my French in writing in French. At home we speak in French, but also I have many friends, and most of them speak French, and not French for France. They speak French also from different parts of the world also. Because the question of accent also is a very important question. I grew up with people who had accent in my family, so I'm so used to this kind of non-classic, normal way of speaking French that I feel at home when I feel some kind of strangeness in the accent of French, that I feel at home. And so I was living in this kind of island. And then I realized it was this experience I was describing, that I don't know if it's the language itself which matters, but some way of speaking a language which is nearly a foreign language into the language, that I recognize and that I feel close to. For instance, I give this very classical example. I would not say that I like a lot English, but I love Emily Dickinson English, because she speaks an English which is another kind of English, which is, to me, I hear it and I feel it as a kind of being, not a sister, not a brother, it's of being a stranger into your own language. And so this kind of being a stranger into your own language, to me is very, I have the impression to be in this kind of position here, but now, because I'm writing in French on my little island, I feel that way when I'm back in France and in Paris. And I realized that I didn't choose it. It came that, and it's a reader who can say this, but I realized books after books that in France I have a position of being a kind of singular position in the landscape of a literary world. And I don't know if it's I don't know if it's the fact that I'm writing in French, but also with this constant music of another language, or because I happen to deepen a kind of strangeness between into the writing that I don't really know. But there is an effect of the English, which is a kind of reaction and and transformation, but I would say more on the also I don't trust anymore French as I used to. I don't really have the same kind of need about with the French language, except when it's the French in French becomes another kind of language, which is French but not French, like Emily Dickinson in English. So I think the fact of living in another language has done that to me, maybe more rapidly than if I had been or stayed in France, because I think most of the writers actually experience that. But sometimes it goes different. More rapidly, or I don't know, differently because of the environment.
I'd like to come back maybe later to the back and forth between as an art critic or writing about a writer, whether it is about Annie Arnaud, whether it is about Clarice Lispector, or whether it is about Kateb Yassine. And you have published different texts. The one on Clarice Lispector is just coming out now, I think.
No, soon.
Soon, yeah. But maybe you have questions for Patrick Autréaux, and since we are a smaller group, maybe we could have some questions.
You talk about the fog of writing and how you don't think when you write, but you're not a surrealist. So you're not producing words in some sort of flow. If I understand it right, what you're talking about has got to do with a sense of place, right? And it reminded me, I was here many years ago when you talked, I think it was with the Irrégulier, and you talked about how that began. You had been somewhere in Paris and you had seen something. And I wanted to think about turning it the other way around. And it often struck me that when you're a reader, sometimes that happens. You're reading something and you get this incredibly strong sense of place, but it's completely personal. It's of no interest to anyone else. But it's what makes you, in a sense, it's like a leitmotif through the whole text that you're reading. And so there's a kind of parallel between the writer and the reader.
Yeah, true. It's true that, about the fog, yes, I'm not a surrealist, but I'm close to psychoanalyst. So, and I can't deny it. And so this also, and also I specify I specify the fact of listening and way of listening. And also I realize that it's, when I begin, always I feel a very strong presence in me, which is very usually a book. It doesn't have a real shape. There's a kind of presence which is mixing voices, places, time, colors, and then all the work is to try to give form to this kind of presence, I feel. And I don't think it's a supernatural presence. I think it's most of the time it's when I'm thinking a lot about this and something is appearing and there is a structure, because also I apply to work very regularly, so there's a kind of very ascetic or monastic structure in my life, which is helping me probably to give form to this fog inside, and but also not to let it completely master the writing. So that would be the process. But about what you said about the encounter, it's like encountering, these poets of the German Romanticism. It's like entering, meeting some place, which place are beings. They have a special sort of energy to you, and that most of the time, and because most of the time they trigger memories or forgotten memories, and especially in Les Irréguliers, it was especially the case. It was a visit to a friend who was in a retention center, and suddenly time disappeared. And it was a mix, during a few moments, but a mix of time and space all together, not knowing anywhere if I was in the 21st century or in another time. And that is, most of the time, it's the beginning of a book for me. Because at that moment, I lose also words. Because there is no words really in me to describe these complicated sensations. And I know that it is a well of a book. But that also sometimes there are moments in between books that I don't write, and because I'm waiting for that moment that can occur or not.
I have a question about La Voix, écrite. When I read it along with other books on writing, such as L'écriture comme un couteau by Ananda Devi. Annie Arnaud. Merci. My question is, in that book, the character is a writer and who has cancer and who sent his manuscript to an editor, and then he's waiting for that editor's response. And afterwards they met, and the character is sick, but there is somewhere in the book he said he was converted to writing, as if writing is a salvation. It's something that can save him, not from dying, but maybe from being remembered. So what is the extent, or to what extent one can be saved by writing? I don't know if it makes sense.
I have quite evolved on this subject. I think this book, La Voix, écrite, was referring to a moment of achieving the first book, especially after this experience of not being sick, but facing death, and then reconsidering through this experience, reconsidering in a way all the literature he had written, but he has also read. It's also a book about being a reader. At the end of the book, there's a long list of many books, which are, to me, a kind of raft for people who are nearly drowned. And so I'm always hesitating with the word salvation, or because I don't believe in it. I only think, especially in this book, that it was also a moment where the narrator wants to achieve at least one book which could maybe help, as some books have helped him. It was a kind of debt he has to pay back to the books he had read, and then reconsidering what literature meant to him, after that, actually, after that book, I went to a big crisis, which was I describing, especially the more acute moment was this moment I was describing in New York City. Because I had the impression that in the way I was completely into this book and completely, I really felt that I had accomplished something, and even I had understood something different about literature. But then the world is greater than my little conclusion, and so after that I'm more into this, and I'm still in this moment of being with the sentiment or impression of being important in front of not the world, of course, but even about the writing itself and about what it does.
You have a text, I think it's 2019, la littérature ne soigne peut-être que si le soignant, elle, est devenu impuissant.
Yeah, I see, it comes from my previous work as a doctor. I think the
you
time.
talk a lot about the desiccation of the medical
world,
does.
Yeah. But I really think that you experience the fact of being a doctor when you are a medical doctor, when you are you cannot cure somebody, and I think literature is exactly the same for me. The moment I realized that it was impossible for me to really be on the level of the ideal I had just after being sick. So I excuse myself, it's because I was still sick. But after that, I'm in the same kind of mood, which is not, I would say, it's, I'm like Freud, I'm pessimistic on the daily life and quite optimistic in the long term. I would say that. So I hope maybe, I don't think about salvation, I don't think about even that it can help. But at least it's there, and sometimes it can do something I don't plan, and maybe not, and it's okay. So but I am still in the process, because it's being in this kind of state of mood is also you're also threatened very easily by the questioning of doing what you do. So it's always this kind of fight between questioning what you do and then letting your world do what it does. But it's an ongoing question.
I was going to say, and the mystique are very present in your writing, or you're thinking about it. And your last novel, La Sainte de la famille, which is 2023, does explore some of that. The
liminal
space.
The mystical literature was very important for me. Most of my books are autobiographical materials that I use, but I realized that I was not placing myself in the autofiction movement. I didn't feel very close to the writers who were writing in this field, like Ernaud and others, Guibert. But I was very connected to the autobiographical writing of the mystics, probably because they are, and in a way, they are closer to the psychoanalyst also. Very often they were master of spirits. And it's when I decided to reread at some point in my youth some mystic by chance, that I realized how I was going to write this first experience that I made, that I described in my first book when I had this announcement of death. I had a kind of very strange moment of being having a kind of desolation into me, and in the same time being full of something, full of feeling empty and full at the same time. And during many years, this experience, which is very similar to the mystical experience some mystics describe or Buddhists can describe, was some place around what I was going on and on without being able to write, because it was also a place without word. It was ecstasis, orgasm, ecstasis, death. Yeah, a mix of everything. And it's when I accepted the idea and rereading some mystic of going back to this place with some words I was given by the mystics, that I was able to give the first form of this experience. And then it was a kind of a well. It was the beginning of the book, because since then I did not stop. And I realized that even this experience in New York City I was describing, there is probably a similar nature about mental nature of some breakdown which occur at some point in my life. And I realized that always this kind of breakdown are the seeds of books. And that is a mystery also for me, because some people, have breakdown and real breakdown. They have not the possibility of transforming this breakdown into a seed of a book. That is a mystery for me.
And yet you just wrote something that is part of the trilogy. La Sainte de la famille and next
with La Sainte de la famille, as I was describing, is when I began to write it. It was I was not planning to write several books, and then it opened. That is also a kind of very very surprising. It makes you very humble, because the fact of willing to write has nothing to do in this event, in this opening. It's probably that you go to some places into yourself that is an opening of something. You don't know what. Unknown tombs or a kingdom inside, and it opens, and then you have to grab it and construct it, and then write it and invent it. It's like the invention of the cross in the mythology. You in fact you don't find what is buried. You find some crumbs, and then you invent it. That's exactly what I do in the writing all this text. It's a kind of energy which open, an energy and words which opens.
Thank you. I think we have time maybe just for one more question.
Could you I wanted to go back to what you wrote about time, that you don't experience it in a linear phase, linear way, but you experience it as I think you said a conch shape. Could you say some more about that?
That I discovered very late. In my 40s, I was reading Nabokov's autobiography, and sorry. Yeah. And he's speaking about his synesthesia. He's seeing words and letters with colors. And so I said, well, that's strange. I was doing some research, and then I found that there was a special kind of synesthesia, which is named space-time synesthesia, where people, and it's, it does not really give any kind of other ability, but people see the days or the months in a very kind of special form, of their own. For instance, I see, when I think about a year, the months, January, February, when I pronounce the words, they are connected in a kind of, they are falling down like this and doing a shape like this. And I see there are some bumps into one. In June, there is a bump, and I don't really know why. And then September is doing a kind of form like this, and then October. And it's always the same. Apparently, according to neurologists, it's always the same kind of shape. For the week, it's the same process, a different one. And I've also a visualization of chronology. When I think about chronological history, my grandfather was a great fan of chronology, so I had to learn a lot of dates of the French history. So, but I don't see them as a linear thing. I see them as a sinuous, which is very like a snail or a conch like this. And that gave me probably very young. Now I'm getting older, so it's not the same. But I had a very, very, very good memory. It was very useful for my studies. And apparently, people who have this kind of shape of space-time shape, synesthesia, they have a very good memory because I memorize in space, not in time, in space. And but that was a problem for writing, because most of the, especially when you learn how to write, you learn in a very linear way. You add some facts, especially when you're a teenage, you add facts and you construct a story with a kind of logical, with also time has an evolution. There is an evolution. That I wasn't capable of doing that. And during years, it was very complex. I had learned how to do it, but it was not natural. And it's when I realized that probably it was this neurological particularity that maybe I was thinking about at that time, I had nothing to prove also to myself. So I let it go, and we will see what it's going to do in the writing. And that's how it transformed little by little my first writing into books, constructed as they are constructed, because they have a construction which has integrated this particularity. I don't know if that we should ask a specialist of Nabokov if his synesthesia has transformed his way of writing, because the association of letters, colors, Scriabin was associating notes of music and colors. Rimbaud maybe, because of his face, it's not sure, but maybe. So a lot of creative people have this kind of particularity, and sometimes it transforms their work, sometimes not.
It's interesting because when you were introducing Patrick, you described his work as having, different sort of places that you could, that it opens up into. Like, so I can, I sort of see this, what you're describing, like with your chronological mind, that you can go to a place and it can sort of open out into another vista, all within one work.
It's possible also that this kind of particularity led me to the painter very early. It was also a chance of meeting some friends, but also the fact of I don't have a lot of writers friend or musician, but painter, yes. And I would not say that I write as if I was a painter, because it's not really true. But I feel this connection with the painting very close.
An affinity to the way painters.
to the space, into this painting. And each time especially certain painters I'm close to, they have most of them have a reflection about the time in their painting. Also, they are about this process, which is it's an abstract way of saying how time, which is, relativity has told us, it is connected to space also, how you transformed it in your own medium, in the painting and the writing. Maybe in a way, sometimes it's easier with the painting, because writing is subjected to so many cultural incentives or requirements or injunctions that I had to get rid of that during years and years and years, and that's probably why I was able to achieve one book so late. I assume.
Do you feel an affinity with Saint Augustine? With Augustine.
Ah.
Well, because I listened to your
of course, yes.
To your inner probing and reflection about time.
Yes.
Like you're Augustinian.
Yes. Well, I could be Augustinian.
Well, you just need that.
But it's true that I'm closer to the Carmel mystics.
Yeah. I noticed also that coming from the mystics, that creation of inner space, inner spaces, where they can live happily or unhappily.
It was. I read them since teenage times, and I was very influenced by them, especially Juan de la Cruz, probably the most.
I want to thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Patrick, for
Thank you
this
to
evening.
you. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you so much.